What if, in a single year, the entire balance of global power shifted and the world's financial center moved permanently to the east? Imagine waking up in 2028 and discovering that China not only grew, but officially surpassed the United States as the largest economy on the planet. What would that mean for you, for the markets, and for the future of the world order? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. For decades, analysts discuss this possibility as a distant, almost theoretical scenario, an alternate economy reserved for academic studies and statistical projections. But what if that moment finally arrived? What if, instead of speculation, it became reality? Throughout this narrative, we will delve into a true economic simulation exploring not just numbers, but profound consequences. Trade realignments, monetary disputes, geopolitical shocks, and a complete rearrangement of what you know as the global economy. Perhaps you've already felt how small economic changes can alter your routine. Prices rising without warning, jobs shifting, technologies appearing and disappearing rapidly. Have you experienced this? Now imagine these movements multiplied by the force of a historical transformation. When a superpower changes its position in the world rankings, nothing remains the same. What if economy, each country, each market, and each citizen becomes part of a new global architecture? And this shift doesn't happen in a vacuum. It generates tension, creates uncertainty, and opens up unexpected opportunities. As China takes the lead, the entire planet needs to recalibrate its strategies. Governments rush to redefine alliances, megacorporations restructure production chains, and investors try to decipher the new risk map. What happens to the dollar? What happens to trade agreements? Which sectors flourish and which collapse? In a global economy, what if of this magnitude? Even the smallest decision can trigger systemic impacts. Consider the symbolism of this milestone. For more than a century, the United States has been the epicenter of innovation, capital, and economic influence. But if that leadership changes hands, if the gravitational pull of the world economy shifts to Asia, we are talking about a point of no return, a moment that redefines an entire historical timeline. What you are about to explore is not fiction. It is a possible future path shaped by trends already visible today. Stay with me until the end, because understanding the early signs of this transition can reveal a lot about the future that awaits us. And remember, every global economic shift begins with a tipping point. 1 year, one number, a new leader. Now, let's move into this alternative scenario and observe the exact moment when change becomes inevitable. As we begin to navigate this critical point in economic history, you may already be feeling a mixture of curiosity and unease. That's natural. When we imagine such a profound shift in the global power structure, something within us tries to find references, personal experiences, any clue that helps us understand what this would mean in our daily lives. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you so far. Your perception, your doubts, your vision of what it would be like to live in a world where China definitively takes the top spot in the global economy. These exchanges not only enrich the discussion, but also help build a community of people who want to decipher the course of this future together, an alternate future. And if you feel that this content helps you see the world with more clarity, reflection, and depth, liking the video is a simple but powerful way to show it. Believe me, each like pushes this channel further, allowing more people to awaken to these scenarios, these economic what-if hats shape how we understand our collective future. Similarly, when you choose to subscribe, you're doing more than just pressing a button. You're silently saying, I want to continue thinking about the future. I want to be part of this journey. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, allowing complex narratives like this to continue being produced with depth, care, and vision. And as we continue to move forward in this scenario, each comment, each interaction, and each new subscription helps to sustain this exploration of the global economy, futurology, and the invisible forces that shape our lives. Now, with this connection established, let's delve a little deeper into this transformation that is beginning to redefine the planet, observing how the first signs of disruption begin to spread. When we look more closely at this turning point, we realize that China's rise didn't happen abruptly. It was built in layers, quietly, while the world focused on other conflicts and distractions. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because behind the overtaking in 2028 lies a combination of strategic decisions, collective mindsets, and structural transformations that reveal a hidden truth about how economic power shifts hands. None of this is accidental. It's a result of continuous calculation, a journey that began decades earlier when China realized that the future will be defined not only by capital, but by adaptability. Artificial intelligence was the primary driver of this acceleration, not just as a tool, but as infrastructure. While many economies treated AI as a trend, China treated it as the backbone. Entire factories began operating in near-perfect cycles, guided by algorithms capable of predicting failures, adjusting rhythms, and reducing costs almost invisibly. This advanced automation didn't replace the workforce all at once. It reorganized the country, and paradoxically, it stabilized some of the demographic impacts, offsetting the reduction in the active population with precision productivity. It is at this point that the difference begins to become insurmountable. At the same time, Chinese megacorporations were expanding rapidly, not only in the technology sector, but also in energy, logistics, transportation, telecommunications, and digital finance. These companies grew as interconnected organisms, supported by a state network that understood that scale was not just a competitive advantage, it was a geopolitical weapon. They created ecosystems so vast that they became indispensable to dozens of countries, and each new dependency built abroad reinforced the center of gravity within Chinese territory itself. Another essential element was a strategic control of commodities. While part of the world struggled to adapt to cyclical supply and demand crises, China consolidated quiet influence in key regions, securing access to critical minerals, shipping routes, and long-term supply agreements. In a fragile global landscape, this stability was priceless. It transformed China into a reliable supplier in an increasingly unpredictable world. The plausibility of this overtaking also rests on structures that were already visible but often underestimated. Manufacturing dominance, for example, was never just about volume. It was about the ability to adapt quickly to new technologies, absorb changes, and reinvent processes. The digital payments infrastructure, adopted en masse by the population, created a faster, more measurable, and more efficient economic flow than any traditional Western system. And of course, the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative was not just a logistics project. It was a network of economic, political, and even symbolic influence that repositioned dozens of countries around New Center. Each of these elements, individually, would already have a significant impact. Together, they formed the tipping point, a moment where some of internal and external forces made inevitable what, for years, many analysts called merely a hypothesis. This is the backdrop that explains how China not simply grew, but surpassed. And as we see these pieces fitting together, we realize that this turning point reveals much more than numbers. It reveals a profound shift in the logic of global power, a shift that has not yet finished unfolding. Write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. So I know you're following along on this journey. When the news spread through international markets, the reaction didn't come in gentle waves, but in successive shocks, almost as if the financial system had received an electric shock. Suddenly, global indices began to repricing risk with a speed reminiscent of historical moments of disruption. It wasn't just a numerical outperformance of the American economy. It was a perception that the structural axis of the world economy had shifted. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because behind this apparent volatility, there were subtle mechanisms that revealed changes in mindset, hidden strategic decisions, and impacts that many had not yet fully understood. In various financial centers, analysts were trying to interpret what this meant for the coming decades. It was like watching dominoes falling in different directions, some predictable, others completely unexpected. Supply chains, so debated since previous crises, began to rapidly redesign themselves. Companies that depended on Western routes began to see new logistics hubs in Asia not as an alternative, but as an inevitable destination. The transformation was not just operational. It was psychological. Global confidence moved along with capital. And when capital changes direction, it drags entire structures with it. Meanwhile, countries allied with the United States felt a silent pressure, not necessarily to choose sides, but to rebalance priorities. India, for example, saw a historic opportunity at that moment. Accelerating industrialization ceased to be a long-term plan and became a strategic urgency. It was a chance to capture investments diverted by uncertainties and consolidate itself as a growing counterweight. In Europe, the reaction was more fragmented. Some governments sought strategic autonomy to avoid excessive dependence on any superpower. Others, however, moved closer economically to China in search of stability, creating internal tensions and revealing behind-the-scenes deep divergences within the European bloc. In the United States, the movement was different. Analysts had already projected scenarios in which this overtaking could happen, but seeing the projection become reality awakened something more visceral. The country initiated a set of countermeasures that mixed economic stimulus, aggressive industrial policies, and attempts to regain commercial influence. This moment brought to light the hidden truth of all major economic cycles. Whoever loses center stage tries to rearrange the spotlight, adjust the narrative, and regain some degree of protagonism. Each decision made seemed laden with historical weight. But this transition was not smooth. The new distribution of power created unexpected fractures. In some regions, the migration of investments generated rapid prosperity, almost as a positive side effect of the global reorganization. In others, the absence of this capital caused political fragmentation, instability, and even internal disputes over scarce resources. It was a kind of scenario that usually only appears in reports of future predictions, and now it was materializing before everyone's eyes. Each country was forced to reconsider its own role in the world order, as if it were facing a map that changed daily. These collective movements revealed not only immediate reactions, but also new possible trajectories. For some, this change represented opportunity. For others, a growing threat. With each sign of market adjustment, it became evident that the world was entering a territory of geopolitical future completely different from what we have experienced in recent decades. And as these forces realigned, it became clear that there were still deeper layers of this transformation waiting to be explored, layers that explain not only the present, but where this great economic shift might lead us. Write in the comments, I'm on this journey too, if this analysis makes sense to you. As the global economy began to absorb the impact of this historic turning point, a new tension emerged almost silently, but with enough force to reshape the logic of global transactions. The dispute ceased to be merely industrial or technological and shifted to the heart of the international financial system, the currency that defines value, trust, and direction. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at this point that the most important revelations appear, behind the scenes where invisible decisions shape the destiny of entire countries. With China taking the top economic position, the yuan began to gain a space that, for decades, seemed unattainable. It ceased to be merely the currency of an emerging power and began to occupy the role of a significant reserve in the vaults of various central banks. The transformation was not immediate, but resulted from a strategic mindset built over years, where Beijing expanded bilateral agreements, strengthened regional trade, and consolidated financial instruments that offered something many countries had long sought: alternatives. This movement coincided with a shift in global perception. When economies see their future tied to the fastest-growing economies, the natural tendency is to seek protection and alignment, and that is exactly what happened. The result? A slow but consistent shift of oil and commodity contracts toward the Asian market. It wasn't just about the economic aspect. There was a powerful symbol in this migration, a kind of hidden truth that few openly admitted. The world was learning to trade under a new shadow. Many nations realized that relying exclusively on the dollar meant being vulnerable to political cycles and unilateral decisions. Thus, diversifying reserves, once a prudent recommendation, became a strategic necessity. It was like adjusting the rudder in the midst of a silent storm, guided by the intuition that the previous scenario wouldn't return anytime soon. But history never operates in absolutes. And despite the rise of the yuan, the dollar remained strong, supported by the depth of American financial markets, accumulated institutional confidence, and a global military presence that still influenced routes, agreements, and perceptions of security. This duality created something entirely new in the modern economy, a bipolar monetary order, where two currencies vie for influence in an unstable, competitive, and historically unprecedented environment. It wasn't a replacement, It was a forced coexistence, full of ambiguities and tensions. This fragile balance meant that every decision by central banks carried the weight of a geopolitical choice. Migrating reserves to yuan could mean access opportunities, but also brought countries closer to a network of influence led by China. Maintaining high dollar positions preserved stability, but reinforced dependencies that many already considered risky. It was a layered game with invisible impact, where each move revealed deepened tensions and changed the course of international negotiations. At the same time, investors watched this process with a mixture of fascination and concern. A bipolar system demanded new strategies, new expectations, and a much more flexible mindset. The fluctuations were not merely economic. They were symbolic. Each swing represented a fragment of this global transformation, a clue as to which force might consolidate in the coming decades. And as this monetary conflict intensified, it became clear that the changes would not be confined to financial charts. They would shape alliances, long-term decisions, and the very narrative of world power. This currency dispute is not merely technical. It reflects the larger journey we are witnessing. It exposes vulnerabilities, reveals hidden strategies, and signals that the stability many took for granted is being rebuilt on new ground. And as this clash progresses, we realize there is much more behind this transformation than numbers can show. Comment below, that makes sense to me. As the monetary landscape began to reorganize, another silent force was advancing beneath the surface, preparing an even deeper shift. It was as if, while the world debated currencies, a technological transformation was gaining momentum, shaping a new kind of global influence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is behind the scenes that the true paradigm shift occurs, where economic growth transforms into something far more difficult to contest: technological dominance. Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing have ceased to be merely industrial centers or regional innovation hubs. They have become the epicenter of a revolution that transcends borders, exporting entire technology systems, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, financial platforms based on quantum algorithms, as if they were essential new infrastructures for developing countries. The impact of this was enormous, because it wasn't just about products, but complete ecosystems capable of redefining how companies operate, how governments manage data, and even how populations interact with the market itself. It was the export of a new digital mindset. As these technologies spread, emerging economies began to adopt them not as a secondary option, but as a preferred solution. There was efficiency, there was competitive cost, but there was something deeper: the feeling of participating in a new technological journey, where Asia led not only in scale, but in speed of adaptation and the audacity to implement systems that many Western countries still treated with caution. This difference in pace began to open a competitive gap. While some Western companies were analyzing risks, Asian megacorporations were already in the execution phase. And it was at this accelerated pace that the shift in power became evident. Companies that once dominated global markets felt the immediate impact. It wasn't just competition. It was structural replacement. Chinese platforms began to become the standard in critical sectors, from autonomous transportation to digital commerce, from cybersecurity to AI-based credit systems. It was like watching a ship's engine being replaced in the middle of the ocean. Silent for some, brutally clear for those following the revelations of this process. This was the moment when economic power undeniably transformed into technological power. It was no longer a question of who produced or sold more, but of who dictated the invisible rules of how the world worked. Whoever controlled AI systems would control decisions. Whoever mastered robotics would control productivity. Whoever led quantum development would control time, literally the speed of calculation that defines what could be predicted, simulated, and decided. And for the first time in decades, this control was shifting hemispheres before everyone's eyes. The global scene took on an almost cinematic tone. It was like watching a slow-motion sequence where, little by little, the center of gravity of innovation shifted from Silicon Valley to Asia. The difference is that, this time, there was no clear turning back on the horizon. The change was not temporary. It was structural. And the more companies, governments, and institutions connected to these exported technological systems, the more the world realized that this dependence would create new asymmetries, new alliances, and new vulnerabilities. Each country that adopted these platforms took a subtle step towards a new logic of alignment. It wasn't explicit, it wasn't announced, but it was there in the data flows, in the digital infrastructures, and in the signed contracts. Technological transformation thus became a geopolitical transformation, uniting the two forces in a movement that was still far from reaching its peak. And as we observe this shift more broadly, we realize that this displacement still holds layers of impact that are only beginning to reveal themselves. Write in the comments, I'm on this journey too. As Asian technological advancement consolidated and began to shift global power structures, the West awoke to a reality that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about losing markets. It was about losing prominence, influence, and the very ability to dictate the course of innovation. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because it is precisely in the West's reactions that we find some of the most intense revelations of this global transformation, revelations that expose mindsets, decisions, and fragilities that have been hidden for years. In the United States, the initial shock gave way to an aggressive response. It was necessary to recover ground, and quickly. Reindustrialization ceased to be a political proposal and became a national guideline. Factories previously considered obsolete underwent accelerated modernization, driven by billions of dollars in federal incentives aimed at advanced automation, semiconductors, and domestic artificial intelligence. The country launched a so-called Resilience Economy Program, an initiative that sought to rebuild internal capabilities, reduce external dependencies, and strengthen strategic sectors that, for decades, had been outsourced to other regions. It was a clear attempt to strengthen the economic foundations to prevent the gap with Asia from becoming irreversible. But this recovery was accompanied by tensions. To protect emerging industries, new trade barriers began to appear, altering global flows and causing direct impacts on international trade. At the same time, entire sectors dependent on Asian supply chains faced cost increases, disruptions, and uncertainties. The effort to rebuild autonomy exposed old contradictions. How to reindustrialize without causing structural inflation. How to stimulate internal innovation while restricting external collaboration. Each decision seemed to carry a price, as if the country were trying to rewrite its own economic identity while balancing risks and urgencies. In Europe, the reaction was more complex and fragmented. While part of the continent advocated greater economic integration with China, seeking growth opportunities and privileged access to new Asian technologies, another segment viewed this movement with concern, insisting on strengthening historical ties with the United States. This dilemma created deep internal fissures, revealing a hidden truth. Europe was not just an economic bloc, but a mosaic of divergent interests that, in the face of a transforming global scenario, was beginning to show itself more vulnerable than many imagined. Debates about security, technological autonomy, and energy dependence became central. The feeling was of walking on terrain that changed with every step. Amid all this, international institutions seemed to struggle to keep pace with the change. Financial bodies that, for decades, had acted as pillars of stability began to face unprecedented pressures. The possibility of a new wave of global economic contraction, a kind of synchronized recession, began to be seriously discussed. The risk of a global recession had ceased to be merely an academic study and transformed into a shadow hanging over meetings, reports, and negotiations. The question was not whether there would be turbulence, but what its intensity and duration would be. Tensions were rising because every adjustment made by the West, every subsidy, every tariff, every strategic redirection, triggered reactions in interdependent global chains. The repercussions were felt in emerging markets, in diplomatic corridors, and even in the routines of companies that depended on international stability to operate. Macroeconomic impact. This dispute amplified the feeling that we were living in a critical moment, where today's decisions would shape decades of economic trajectory. And, observing the scenario unfold, it became clear that the West was facing a critical point. Adapting meant accepting a new world order. Resisting meant facing high and unpredictable costs. Collapsing meant losing what little control remained. It was a historical crossroads, marked by uncertainties, internal pressures, and a global repositioning that was still far from stabilizing. Comment below, that makes sense to me. So I know you're following this line of reasoning. As we watch the West attempt to reorganize its space on a global chessboard that no longer responds to the old rules, something interesting begins to happen. The future ceases to be a single, predictable line and transforms into a network of possibilities, each influenced by decisions that seem small today but carry a profound impact. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in this intertwining of potential paths that we can see how this Chinese rise in 2028 not only creates a new present, but also inaugurates a silent dispute over which version of 2035 the world will experience. When we analyze this journey more carefully, we realize that we are facing three trajectories that coexist, compete, and intersect. The first is what many experts describe as bipolar stability. In this scenario, both the United States and China manage to find an uncomfortable, yet functional, balance. Tensions continue to exist, but become manageable. Trade adjusts, markets breathe, and the global economy grows again, albeit with constant caution. It's like walking on firm ground, but with cracks that constantly remind us that any abrupt movement can alter the equilibrium. Here, there are no absolute winners. There's only a strategic coexistence to avoid a collapse that no one wants. The second path is more turbulent. In it, globalization, that mechanism that has kept the world interconnected for decades, begins to fragment. Supply chains divide into blocks, each protected by its own rules and interests. Emerging countries, without access to multiple centers of influence, end up suffering from instability, high costs, and reduced opportunities. Innovation slows down because the global flow of knowledge becomes trapped in isolated technological islands. It's as if the planet is reverting to operating on multiple incompatible systems, a kind of silent regression that undermines advances achieved over the years. The feeling is of a world that still breathes, but with increasing difficulty. And there's a third scenario, the most dramatic and, at the same time, the most plausible for some analysts. It's the moment when the economic, political, and technological axis definitively shifts to Asia. China assumes leadership not only as the largest economy, but also as a definer of financial standards, platforms, and architectures. Countries wishing to remain competitive begin to operate within this ecosystem, adopting technologies, rules, and structures designed in Beijing. Here, the world doesn't enter into direct conflict, but into something even deeper, a structural dependence, where influence doesn't need to be imposed by force. It is established out of necessity. It's a future where transformation doesn't happen through rupture, but through inevitable adaptation. What's most intriguing is realizing that these three scenarios aren't isolated stories. They coexist on the horizon, vying for space, awaiting the next decisions. And, beyond technical analyses or mathematical projections, there's a hidden truth that few openly admit. The future isn't decided solely by the great powers, but also by silent adjustments, by the daily choices of governments, institutions, companies, and even consumers. Every step counts. Every decision shapes the landscape. Every reaction contributes to pushing the world toward one of these possibilities. As we continue to observe this flow of events, it becomes clear that nothing is set in stone. The decade unfolding before us is the most volatile and decisive period in an entire generation. The final trajectory, stability, fragmentation, or Asian centralization, will emerge from the set of choices we are witnessing now, almost as if the world were writing its next version in real time. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, you've probably felt that same deep curiosity that drives this entire journey. The desire to understand the world in a broader, more conscious, and more strategic way. And that's exactly why I want to invite you to stick around. If this content has helped you see new angles, new possibilities, and even some hidden truths about the future of the global economy, consider subscribing to the channel. This way, you ensure that this conversation continues, that these scenarios continue to reach you with the depth they deserve. If something in this video touched you, provoked you, or simply opened new perspective, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." This is the simplest way for me to know that you lived through this complete experience, that you went through each step, and that this reflection made sense to you. Oh, and of course, if at any point during this video you felt a connection, clarity, or even a little "now I understand" moment, leave a like. This helps this content reach more people who, like you, want to understand the impact of these transformations on our future. And before we go, there's a video here that perfectly complements what we explored today. Click and continue watching it.